Right. So as I mentioned earlier, we don't have a lot of people today, so I'm going to lecture and I'm going to take attendance later to encourage everyone to come to class. So question 1, we're looking at page 19, where we have met the new character of Atia, Saleh's colleague, and here the story is talking about their history. This is on the right near the bottom. There had been a moment, after enough years had passed, when we considered becoming lovers. Then the moment passed because, for starters, H had called Atia in one day and read her the riot act, which means he gave her a very strong warning. In other words, H did not want them to be a couple. It was just after my questionable short story collection was published when H was not sure of my loyalties. 6 months later, H didn't care one way or another if the two of us were lovers, because by then it had been established that the short story collection, which sold a total of 16 copies, was hardly some foreign plot to bring down the government. Nevertheless, Atya and I had already let H's intrusion make the decision for us. It was as if his nosing into our lives was a source of assurance rather than anxiety. We didn't have to listen to him, but we did. When it really counted, we did. The things that we were not certain of, a guy like H could decide for us. He was like a holy man you go to for advice, a therapist. So the question is, does this description of a state interrogator make sense? To call him a holy man or a therapist. What do these three kinds of people have in common? What kind of attribute is shared by a state interrogator, a holy man, and a therapist? What about they seem like they have all the answers. A holy man apparently is inspired by some god. A therapist, if you have ever talked with a therapist, it always feels like they know what's wrong with you, but they just aren't telling you. Um, and a state interrogator also, right? As we discussed last week, they're always looking for clues to things that you might have done wrong. So they have an idea about you, but you don't know what that idea is. So it also feels like they have all the answers. I think in these three, the most interesting thing to talk about is the therapist. Does it have to be the case that your therapist feels like they know everything? What exactly is the relationship between a therapist and their patient? Assuming that you choose to go to a therapist, not like you are ordered to by a court. You go to a therapist because you feel like something might be wrong in your life, or you feel like the way that you think is not very healthy, and you want to find a way to improve your mental health. So the first thing to do is to figure out why you feel like you need to improve. What are the problems? And then you can talk about how to improve on those problems. Now, if you knew what your problems were and how to improve, you wouldn't need to go see a therapist. You could just think about it and talk to yourself. So most of us believe that it's helpful to see a therapist because they have professional training, they have experience dealing with other people with similar issues. So when we walk into a therapist's office, we already assume that the therapist knows more than we do and perhaps can use that knowledge to figure out the answer to our questions. We usually don't think what if the therapist also doesn't know? If we have that thought when we go in, then it may keep us from telling them everything that might be relevant. It might make us hesitate before we follow their advice. And that kind of just goes against the purpose of seeing a therapist in the first place. And maybe there's a similar relationship dynamic with holy people as well. Whether or not you are religious, I'm sure you have thought about questions such as like, why are we here? What is the purpose of life? How can I be a good person? These kinds of big questions. And the reason that they're big is because there is no one answer. But some people feel like they need an answer. Any answer that they themselves think of feels like it could be wrong. And since these are such big, important questions, you really don't want to follow the wrong answer. So for these people, they might turn to a source of authority. And one of the main sources of moral authority is religion. So you might talk to a holy person. And what makes them holy, this is shakier than a therapist. But on the one hand, maybe they know more about their religion than you do, maybe. And on the other hand, usually the way that they present themselves, the way that they talk and behave and interact with people also seems to be slightly different from the way most people do it. And these two things together give the impression that they are like better morally, or that they have more moral knowledge that perhaps you can learn from. So the similarity between these two is that everybody has questions and everybody's answers might be slightly different, but these two kinds of people apparently have a set of answers that could make sense for could make more sense than the answers that you might have for yourself. And so now we go back to the state interrogator, especially this context, right? I read you this context because I think it's important. We're not talking about like, how should you follow the law, or like, what is good for your country. We're talking about, should I marry my colleague, or should I like start a relationship with my colleague? And in a different country, the state would not care. But in Iran, where the state cares about many things, apparently the state cares about these two as well. Um, we have two different perspectives here. H is thinking that Saleh might be a threat to the government. So, of course, he doesn't want that threat to spread to other people. He doesn't want Saleh influencing other people. But for Saleh and Atya, they're stuck in a kind of will they, won't they kind of gray area. Um, and, if it's just between those two, it's a simple question of, if I want to be with them, do they want to be with me? And they have to find some way to answer that question uh, without being too awkward or embarrassed about it. And also in a way that they can trust each other. Like if Saleh asks Atya, he needs to be sure that Atya says yes, not because, or because she wants to, and not simply because her friend Saleh is asking. So like this kind of question is one of the more complicated personal questions that we face in life. So they took the easy way out, even though H gives them an answer based on a different standard of judgment. It is still an answer. And so they decide to follow it. Of course, at the beginning, they have to because he's a state interrogator. But then he says, even after H doesn't care anymore, they still follow that original choice. Because in the midst of uncertainty, it is, after all, a clear option. It was a source of assurance rather than anxiety. It's kind of like the stock market, right? Whenever there's big news, um, the stock market reacts in either one of two ways, right? It can rise or it can fall. And if you pay attention, you might notice that usually it falls when people aren't sure what the news will mean for the market. But if the consequences are pretty clear, then the market will rise. It doesn't matter if it means that a business will do better or do worse. The key is uncertainty. If people kind of feel like they understand what's going on, they feel more secure in making investments. So here we're talking about a personal investment. When they have a source of certainty, they are more willing to make a decision. So the therapist is doing it for their job and maybe to help people. The holy man is doing it to help people and maybe because of some selfish uh, motivation. The state interrogator, however, is doing it as a job, but also to, in their mind, protect the country. So, of the three, the state interrogator is the one whose motivations are furthest from helping people. The state interrogator only cares about that the people don't go against the state. But whether it actually helps these people is a secondary consideration. So, does this make sense? In terms of Saleh and Atia's relationship at the time, yes, it kind of does make sense. But in terms of the motivations of these three kinds of people, the state interrogator is a little bit more different. Okay, do you have other thoughts or questions about this one? All right, question 2. Why do you think Saleh doesn't want Zala the beheader to be filmed? And do you agree why or why not? So um, later on, his old colleague and enemy Saeed has a new job for him. The BBC wants them to go interview this woman whose family was killed by the enemy. And so when she was able to kill two of the enemy soldiers, she had cut off their heads and like put them in front of her home. So this is chapter 4, page 27. Let's start here. Will they pay me? She asked. To film you? Yes. But you didn't keep the heads, did you? She looked crestfallen, which means disappointed. I should have kept them? We must get away from here. But they're coming to make the film, yes? No. I mean, yes. But they're only using you. What? Uh, I wondered to myself what kind of knife she'd used in order to cut off those heads. Was it difficult? Did anyone see her do it? All we knew was that for several days, the outside of her hut was decorated with them as if it were a set for some gory medieval war film. Maybe, she said hopefully, they will help me leave this evil land. And, speaking of this evil land, the ground shook and shook, like the local area is being bombed. Above us, the sound barrier was being broken. Americans? A convoy advanced toward us. A convoy is a long line of vehicles. A last-ditch, desperate battle fought by men who should have given up on this area and taken their war somewhere they could actually fight it. I saw Saeed and his British charge stick their heads out of one of the Toyotas as it zoomed past us. The Englishman shouted, "Don't you bloody well lose her." I would have shouted back that he could take his cameras and his recorders and his cash and go fuck himself. But now came the inevitable. Shrapnel, smoke, the earth shuddering as if a prehistoric giant had stepped on its own toes. So, more bombing. I stood with this woman, Zara, who was no one's heroine. If we lived through today, Said would film and the Englishman would interview her, and later, if by some grace of luck she managed to leave this evil land, she'd probably be implicated in war crimes. Because you're not supposed to destroy the bodies of enemy soldiers. Someone with a degree in international law and a regular paycheck would decide that having her 4 brothers, husband, and 3 sons killed in front of her was not reason enough for Zara to take a bit of revenge on a couple of already dead motherfuckers. The children who were playing next door a few minutes earlier were gone, as if they'd never existed. The convoy was gone. Said and his Brit were gone. It was just me and Zara the beheader left in this place, and I didn't even know if it was a friend or foe that was bombing us. Nonplussed, which means not disturbed, she looked at nothing in particular and said, I don't care if I die, but will it help me leave Iraq? Please eat the bread while it's hot. Are they your friends? A sharp whistle went over our heads, and in the vague distance the ground did a somersault, a flip. Bread in hand and half deaf, half blind, I told her, they are not my friends, and now we must leave. To where? We'll start with Baghdad. Her eyes sparkled like a child's. She repeated Baghdad like it was a magic charm. In Baghdad they will film? Inshallah, they will never film. Inshallah means uh, if God wills. So hopefully. So the question is, why doesn't Saleh want her to be filmed? Any thoughts? Well, the obvious one is here, maybe she will get implicated in war crimes. Although I think this is a rather minor concern. She's just an ordinary citizen. I'm pretty sure nobody's going to come grab her and arrest her. So maybe the larger issue is uh, where was it? They're only using you. What do you think he means? The situation is that she has done something unusual, and the BBC feels like this would make for an interesting news story. How would that impact Zara herself? First of all, maybe people will think that she did something illegal. And then secondly, it says here, will they pay you to film you? Yes, so she will get paid. What else? That's it, right? She doesn't get any other, uh, I want to say benefits, but getting arrested isn't a benefit. She doesn't like receive anything else from this exchange. Gets a little bit famous, hopefully not famous enough to get arrested, and she gets a little bit of money. But what she really wants is uh, to, as she said, leave this evil land. And I think it's quite clear that the BBC is not going to help her do that. So Saleh seems to be saying that by getting what they want from her, but not giving her something that she wants, Saeed and the BBC are only using her, exploiting her. Do you think that makes sense? I mean, logically, it does seem like it makes sense. But if you think this makes sense, then isn't every news report using people? Well, not every. Some people, their motivation is to spread the message about something. And in that case, the news report is what they want. But for everyone else, it does seem like the news just uses them, right? But if that's the case, does that make most news unethical? If we're watching news about something and that person doesn't benefit from being at the center of the story, are we also just using them? And if the news story isn't really related to our lives, is it news or is it entertainment? Is it like information that we can use, or is it more like a documentary film? So Saleh seems to not have a lot of faith in his own line of work. He himself is a journalist, but apparently he doesn't think that being a journalist is ethical most of the time. So when Zara asks, they're coming to make the film, yes? His first instinct is to say no, because to him, they're not coming to make the film. They're coming to use her in order to generate publicity and get more fame and hopefully more money. The film itself is not the goal. At least this is how Saleh sees the situation. Um, and as for like, Saleh is a journalist. He does this kind of thing all day, every day. So why does he care about this woman in particular? This part that I didn't read. She had a distant resemblance to Atya, and like Atya, her cheeks flushed red when she was distraught. So apparently, this woman reminds him of the one that got away, and that makes him feel for her and therefore care about her, and therefore he wants to give her honest advice. And then, like, finally, he also talks about the injustice of what if she does get arrested for breaking international law, how that law seems to not care about the actual situation, right? After suffering through this massive tragedy, why shouldn't Zara be permitted to take revenge on some people who are already dead? Of course, there are reasons why she should not be able to do this, but in the moment, faced with this real woman and her real life experience, those abstract reasons seem less convincing. And if you're curious, the reason we are not allowed to mutilate dead soldiers' bodies, first of all, is for to respect people's religious views. Some religions um, believe that after, like, God comes back or something, we will regain the use of our dead bodies. Secondly, and like regardless of whether they believe in that kind of religion, the law should apply to everyone. So that's one reason. Another reason is respect for the families of the dead person. People usually prefer to be able to show a complete body in the coffin at the funeral. And then finally, it's also respect for human dignity in general. The idea that even in death, humans are not just another resource or just another animal. So, like, those are pretty abstract reasons. But to Saleh facing this real life woman in front of him, they feel less convincing than the emotion and the trauma of a person right in front of him. Um, and then, like, one last thing to say about this part: are journalists allowed to pay people for interviews? Is anybody here studying journalism? Journalists are not usually allowed to pay people for interviews. So already, if the BBC does pay them or does pay her, they are also breaking ethical rules. And this kind of adds to Saleh's thinking about the situation. Why are they willing to pay her? Because they know that they are using her and they feel like they should uh, give her some kind of monetary remuneration, some payment um, for exploiting her. If it was a really worthy news story, they would go by the rule book and they wouldn't think about paying the interviewee. So when Saleh says, Inshallah, they will never film, he's hoping that this transaction, this very unethical report, will not happen. I'm thinking if there's a difference between filming her and writing about her. Because, Saleh is a newspaper journalist, so his stories are written maybe with a photo. Um, and for most aspects, written reporting and like TV news can be quite similar, right? You're supposed to be talking about something real that happened. You talk to the people involved. You create a story that you think readers will want to know. But there is a key difference, which is even if you see a photo of the person, you don't really see the person. You don't feel like the person is talking to you. You don't feel like you have some kind of a relationship with the person. You don't create an image of the person in your mind as to like the kind of person they are. And so written journalism puts more power in the writer. They can pick and choose the details, uh, and their perspective will guide how the story is told, and that will guide how we think about the story. But for TV journalism, the image is usually not manipulated in a very significant way. So even if the journalists themselves has their own perspective, and even if they get to choose what to show us and what not to show us, the thing that they do show us, we see clearly. And so there's more power with the viewer to decide about this story. Is it good? Is it bad? Do we like it? Do we not like it? And what do we think about the people involved? And we know this. If you've ever like visited one of those very popular Facebook groups in Taiwan that make fun of journalists for bad reporting, some of them are about bad writing, but most of them are about bad TV reporting. Often they show an image from the TV report to point out what's wrong with this report. And they can do that because, as I said, the image itself is hard to completely control. Whereas usually if they show a piece of bad writing, um, it's because that particular sentence makes no sense, or that particular paragraph is very, very biased. But you do have to read it and you have to think about why it's not a good report. Whereas for a TV report, you see it, you immediately know what's wrong. So in this case, Saleh also does not write about Zara. But if he does write about her, maybe it would be even less ethical. Well, I mean, in terms of journalism ethics, if he doesn't pay her, then it's better. But in terms of like how the story is framed, the perspective that is used, the idea that is presented, Saleh would have more control over that than a TV reporter like Saeed would. So there's more space for him to do something like tricky. Okay, other thoughts or questions about this one? All right, let's move on to question 3. So on page 30, we find out that most of the fighters Saleh knows have joined the same app. I thought this was pretty funny. So here, um, if you remember, one of the people Saleh knew asked him to help, like ask a widow for marriage. So now he is going to visit the widow and he has brought Atya along with him. But as soon as he asks, the father of the widow says, "Are you taking my family for fools?" The father of the young widow and bride-to-be had said this immediately, and my heart sank even before he'd finished. I looked at Atya, who looked away. By now, martyrdom was a way of life. It was the grammar of our everyday lives, not just an appendage to it. In other words, I knew the news of another death was on someone's lips even before the news had been spoken. Atya pressed for the sake of appearances, so she kept asking, "Haji Aga, our intention is pure." She said something about Nasif, the man who wants to marry her, which I didn't catch. I was waiting for the bad news to drop, and then it did. The bride-to-be's father set his phone between us, tapped the app that most of the fighters I knew subscribed to, scrolled down to the latest news from Syria, and there it was, the news of Nasif's martyrdom. When? I asked. Yesterday. I took the cell phone and scrolled through more photos, blood-soaked posts, and also romantic ones, all of them filled with the claptrap of an honorable death. War had turned into a game of telephone tag. So in other words, like spreading gossip, spreading information one person by person. Okay, so uh, the app that most of the fighters I knew subscribe to. When you think of people going to war, do you think of them joining an app? I don't know about you, but I don't. However, if you think about it, it does kind of make sense, right? If you want to go on a date, you join an app. If you want to go like on to like national parks all the time, and this is your hobby, you might join an app. If you like to play video games, you join an app. Why not, if you go fight in a war, you also join an app? An app is simply a location online where people with similar interests might do similar things. And it looks like it's a social media app. So that makes even more sense. In war, communication and information are extremely important. So it makes sense that fighters would want to keep in touch with each other to keep up with the latest news about the war. So yeah, it's unexpected, but it does kind of make sense. But even if the app is originally for that kind of purpose, once humans start using it, it also gets used for other purposes, right? You have blood-soaked posts, so this is like important updates about people, and also romantic posts, um, which at first glance seems like this has nothing to do with war. War, as Saleh has observed it, is not a romantic thing. It could feel romantic before you start fighting, but once you get to the battlefield, it's just ugly. So, like, what's up with these romantic posts? They could be from people who have not yet arrived in battle. They could also be attempts to create meaning in a situation with no meaning. We humans have an instinct and a need to find meaning in things. If you're sitting here and you feel like whatever I'm talking about is meaningless, you'll probably skip class after the break because you want something that feels like it has some kind of purpose or importance. So if I join the war and I have some ideas about like how romantic war can be, and then I get there and I realize no, it's all crap, but I want to keep fighting or I have to keep fighting because I signed a contract or something, then I'm going to try to find meaning in this meaningless situation. And one way to do that might be to find some way to take photos and write articles uh, seeking something meaningful in this situation. And that's how you get those romantic social media posts. And finally, we have the idea war as a game of telephone tag. In daily life, how do we usually get our important information? We have sources. For example, typhoon, the one that's coming for us. How do we learn about what the typhoon is doing? We either go to the Central Weather Bureau's website or we read or watch news that gets their information from the Central Weather Bureau. So there is a source, a trusted source of information. And that source is trusted because they have accurate data that is relatively current, up to date. But what about in war? How do we learn about what's going on in war? Well, usually, for example, let's say there's a war with two sides. This war has many sides. We're going to set it aside for now. But like in a simple war with two sides, usually these two armies would have the most data, but they don't have an incentive to share all of it, right? They need to find some kind of advantage against their enemy. So when they do share information, it's not always 100% trustworthy, but they have the most data. So if we can't trust the source of information, how do we know what's actually going on? You can look through minor sources of information, people who have less data but are willing to share all of it and tell the truth. Or you can rely on people you know who are on the ground, even if they don't have a lot of data. The personal relationship you have with them makes you trust whatever data that they share. That's what's happening here. Social media is a personal connection. But of course, because they don't have a lot of data, it ends up being like you hear from many different people and you have to put it all together to form some kind of picture of what's going on. So that's what Saleh calls telephone tag. This idea or this situation where in a war, nobody is really sure what's going on. This is called the fog of war. And if you play like RTS strategy video games, the fog of war is represented by the fact that you cannot see areas of the map that you have never been to, or that where you don't have like a unit or uh, forces there, right? You have to have people there in order to tell you what's really going on. So it does make sense that in this situation, people have developed an app specifically for fighters to help them gather more information in the midst of this fog of war. Okay, other thoughts are, well, one more thing, right? Which is these fighters are volunteers. They are Iranian volunteers. Earlier last week, we met Afghan mercenaries, so they're paid to fight. But these Iranian volunteers are here because they want to be. If you are fighting because it's your job, then your manager or your superior or your boss would give you the information that you need. So, like, you already have an information structure you can depend on. But if you're a volunteer and you go by yourself or with a small group of friends, you need to find and create your own information structure. And I guess that's why they have developed an app. Okay, other thoughts or questions about number 3? Okay, let's take a long break. Please come back at 10:10. Question 4. So Saleh has another thought about the war on page 30. What do you think he means? Do you agree? Why or why not? Let's take a look at page 30. Ah, so this is after the deal with Nassif and the widow. And so he's thinking about how useless everything is, right? The claptrap of an honorable death. It wasn't just Nassif who died, they'd all died. Mualim was dead, so were several of the Afghans. Khanti hadn't fallen, but the Red House finally had, a place no one should have fought for in the first place. So to him, it feels like they died for no reason. And so he thinks again about this quote. You can tell a true war story if you just keep on telling it. And he thinks about the author of that quote, Hemingway, and another thing that Hemingway once said: in the fall, the war was always there, but we did not go to it anymore. And so Saleh thinks, yes, the war was always there, but in fact, it always came at us. We couldn't avoid it. And it wasn't just one war, it was wars, one blending into the next like an ill canvas. The war never ended. So, first of all, what do you think he's talking about? He is, I guess, joining in and also reporting on a specific war. It is a complicated war uh, with many different parties fighting over different things, but it is still one war. So when he says it wasn't just one war, it was wars, one blending into the next, what is he talking about, or what is he thinking about? So the war against Islamic State was born in the middle of the Syrian civil war, which was born in the middle of tensions in the Middle East caused in part by things like the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. And that was born from the inconclusive result of the uh, first Gulf War in 1991, when the US led a coalition of other nations to attack Iraq and beat them in 100 days, but did not enter Baghdad and did not overthrow Saddam Hussein. And that happened because Iraq invaded Kuwait, its very small neighbor, illegally. And so the UN and the US uh, tried to correct that mistake. And Iraq invaded Kuwait in part out of economic reasons left over from the Iran-Iraq War of the 80s. And that can be traced even further back. So you can kind of see how one war blends into the next. It's never always just one war. So Saleh is thinking the war never ended. If every war is a continuation of a previous war, then this war will also give birth to a new war later. The war was always there, and we couldn't avoid it. But we can also say that this is describing his psychology, his mindset at the time. Right? He was just thinking about all of the men that he knew who died for no real purpose. Um, did they die during the war against the Islamic State? Did they die during the Syrian civil war? Is there a difference? So he's thinking throughout history, throughout men's lives, There will always be wars. And the idea that you might end up in the middle of a war is always there. The war, when he says the war, it's not just one war, right? It's the idea of war never ends. And then, like, one last thing we can say about this is that it could also be the mindset of war, not just the possibility of war, but things like, war trauma, PTSD. We were talking last week about how war seems to give people a better sense of purpose than their meaningless jobs in regular society. And in that case, a returning soldier would bring the war back with him or her in their mind. So even if the war wasn't physically here, we couldn't avoid it. It always came at us. The war in our minds never ended. And that also kind of describes his mindset at the time when he's thinking about these men that he lost. Um, he's also bringing the war with him, even when he's doing something that's not directly related to the war. And this paragraph is also a very interesting segue into the next section when Atya tells Saleh that she's getting married to their boss, whom Saleh doesn't like. So when uh, she says, I've decided to do it, get married," his response is, "I'm in mourning, Atya. Do you have to tell me this now?" Which is kind of funny because, like, in war, everybody is always dying. You're always in mourning. So, like, there is no, if that is a reason why not to tell Saleh, then there is no time to tell him. Because as someone for whom the war never ends, he's always in mourning. There's never a good time. But he also uses it as a kind of joke. So, like, giving us a paragraph about what he's thinking, how he's feeling at that moment, is setting up the joke that Atya is going to tell him she's going to get married. So, like, in this paragraph, we're with Saleh. We feel what he feels. We think what he thinks. We think what he thinks. And so when Atya drops this bombshell news, we feel the same as Saleh does. Like, do you have to make things even worse? Do you have to tell me this now? Okay, other thoughts about number 4? Or if you have questions? All right, let's move on to number 5. Based on the story so far, do you agree with Atya's evaluation of Saleh? And if you don't, how would you describe him and why? This is kind of related to number 2, and you're going to see why in a moment. Page 31. So after learning that Atya is getting married to their boss, Saleh criticizes their boss, criticizes other various men that they work with. Uh, Here he says Mafiha, their boss, is a fraud. He writes all that peace poetry crap. And then Atya kind of agrees with him. She says peace is not a bad thing, even if some people take advantage of it. And of course, by some people, she's talking about Mafiha. Um, so Saleh is pretty mad. And then here he kind of criticizes every like other man that Atya could possibly marry. Uh, Men die while these motherfuckers take their books and photos and films on tour to Europe and win awards for them. Something stinks about all this, Atya. The world fucking stinks. So this line of criticism is similar to the line of criticism about why he doesn't want Zara to be filmed. Right? Feels like these news people, these journalists are using victims of war in order to further their own careers, win awards and prizes and money. But then Atya gives a very interesting response. Something does stink. You're right about that. And that's your self-righteous nagging. You think I don't know what you're up to? What am I up to, Atya? You're no better than Dodong or Saeed or, if you will, Mafiha, my husband to be. You want to manufacture glory for yourself off of dead soldiers' backs. At least a guy like Mafiha just writes a few poems. And he's a first-rate editor. Without him, none of us would have jobs. But what about you? I've read your reports from over there. We all have. You make it sound like you're under attack 24/7. In war, you're always under attack, even when you're not. I don't know about you, but this response to me does not sound very convincing. Maybe it does feel like you're always under attack, but saying this does not really respond to what Atya is saying. So she points that out. Don't give me your philosophical bullshit, Asale. I know you better. Um, right. So this is her evaluation of Saleh, and she seems to be saying that Saleh doesn't like it when reporters build their careers off of victims' backs, but Atya says that he's doing the same thing. Uh, and his response is basically, I'm telling the truth. I'm not like manipulating people, right? When if my reports make it feel like we're under attack 24/7, it is because we're always under attack, even when we're not under attack. Um, but that doesn't really get at the heart of the issue, right? The heart of the issue is like, why is he even there? If he feels like this is unethical reporting, why is he doing it? And the question is relevant because in this same passage, when Atya tells him that she's getting married to their boss, she also says that their boss is offering him another job as the editor of the arts section. So he now has the option to leave the war. He can stop doing this unethical reporting. But he says no. And so Atya then can say, oh, so in fact, you are the same as all these other reporters that you're criticizing. Do you agree? Is Saleh doing this for, what did she say? Um, to manufacture glory for yourself? In a way, we can't really answer this question because we've never read one of his reports. We don't know what kind of perspective he uses. We don't know how he presents himself in the middle of the news. All we can go on is what we have in the novel, which is mostly his inner thoughts and personal accounts of his experiences. And from what we have so far, it doesn't seem to me like he's trying to present himself as full of glory or like doing heroic things as if he's an important person in this war. The one firefight that we have at the beginning of the novel where they're retaking the Red House, he describes that as he can barely see, he's a middle-aged man, he's not doing his job, and they're saved by the Afghan mercenaries. So that doesn't feel very glorious. And then, like, when he starts doing other things, right? Talking to H, visiting the widow that he's proposing marriage to from Nasif, none of that really goes well. Like, so far, he has not really encountered any good things in his life. So it does seem like the opposite of trying to manufacture glory for himself, right? But then if he really is going through lots of crap, why is he talking about it? In other words, what's so important about all of the stuff that he's experiencing? Is it simply to say like my life is so bad because the war is terrible and I can't stop thinking about it. I can't stop going back to fight, even though I know that it's meaningless or I feel like it's meaningless? If that's the case, then like again, we don't know about his reporting, but this novel is kind of manufacturing glory for himself off of his own back. He's treating himself as a very sad victim and a sad character in this story, so that the person uh, who is writing the story, the person who's telling us these things, um, feels comparatively more wise, more knowledgeable. To put it simply, when he says this war is meaningless, how does he know? To be able to say something is meaningless, you have to be able to see what is meaningful and what is meaningless. So by saying the war is meaningless, he is implying that he himself has some kind of standard of judgment, that he is wise and knowledgeable enough to tell us that the war is meaningless and that we should believe him. So presenting himself as a sad sack who's going through shit is also implying that he knows that he's a sad sack going through this shit. But he's telling us for some kind of reason, that there's a purpose that he's telling us this. We're now discussing a separation between Saleh, the character, and Saleh, the narrator, the person telling the story. Saleh, the character, is pathetic, but Saleh, the narrator, seems to have a handle on the situation. He is able to understand how pathetic he himself is, and that makes him seem more important. It's like if, for example, I make a mistake. There's a difference between saying, ah, I made a mistake, and I know I made a mistake, okay? There's a difference. And so that seems to be the difference between Saleh, the character, and Saleh, the narrator. So if he is still manufacturing glory for himself, whether it's on the backs of victims of the war or on the backs of himself, this one particular victim of the war. I mean, think about it. So far, Saleh's experiences that we have read have basically all been negative. Like, what are the odds of that? That the main character of your novel has not a single thing go well for him? It does seem kind of deliberate, right? It seems like the author, or if we're talking about the story, the narrator is trying to present this character as especially pathetic, especially a loser. So we should think about why. And the why seems to be to create a contrast between the character that is being talked about and the person who is talking about that character. Like even this passage, when these words come from Atya's mouth, um, they seem kind of accurate, and that adds to what we're talking about, the difference between Saleh the character and Saleh the narrator, because Saleh the narrator is choosing to include these words said by Atya. He is agreeing with Atya that Saleh, the character, is exploiting people's suffering for his own benefit. So this is kind of, it's not even saying I made a mistake. It's saying I did something wrong and I know that I did something wrong. So the question then becomes, is it better that you know you're doing something wrong? Some people would say maybe yes, because if you know it's wrong, then you can, that's the beginning of finding a better way. But some people might say no, because you know that it's wrong, but you're doing it anyway. So this leads us to an ethical question about the novel itself. Of course, it's fiction, but it's a lot of the elements are based on real life. But within the fictional world of the novel, is it ethical for Saleh to be telling this story, to be like writing this novel for us? Is his motivation purely artistic, as we discussed last week, or is he trying to benefit himself in some way? And is there a difference? Is all art beneficial to the artist? Is that something that cannot be avoided? Is there art without the cult of the artist? Can we enjoy art without caring about the artist? Or if we learn about the artist, um, will it always have a positive effect on the art? Or when I say positive, like if we look at a painting and we think it looks great, and then we learn that the painter was Hitler, obviously the impact will be negative. But at the same time, when you have a person to attach to the painting, it does give the painting more meaning. It has more importance for you. If I show you a random painting, you're like, it's a painting. But if I show you a random painting and I say this was painted by Hitler, then you're paying attention. That's what I mean by positive. Like it takes on more importance. It takes on more significance. Is it possible for art not to do this when we learn more about the artist? So those are the open-ended questions that you can think about from this week. And those questions might be related to the final exam. Okay, any thoughts or questions about this week's discussion? All right, so uh, I'm now going to take attendance, and then I wanted to talk with you about something slightly less related to the reading. But first, let's take attendance.